first hour of the day, we heard from Glenn Kessler and Angie Holland. And now we're going to hear from two people who are going to tell us whether they're wasting their lives or not. They are the preeminent fact checkers, and what we have with us today are two researchers who are going to talk about the effectiveness of fact checking, and we'll take it from there. Ethan Porter is an assistant professor at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs, and also in the Department of Political Science. His research interests include public opinion, political communication, political psychology, and experimental design. Thomas Wood is an assistant professor of political science at Ohio State University. He researches misinformation and whether it's amenable to factual correction. And he also researches political attitudes. So they are going to talk about their work in the literature in general about fact checking. And then we will have plenty of time for questions. So Ethan and Thomas, welcome. And when we get to the Q&A session, just make sure to identify your news outlet. So Ethan and Thomas, welcome, and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. It's really a pleasure to be here. We're going to present some work today that summarizes our contributions to the literature on fact checking, which we can summarize for you right now, which is that Angie Holland and Glenn Kessler are definitely not wasting their lives. That's really the good news that we're going to present to you. The presentation is called "The Effectiveness of Fact Checking in the U.S. Around the World." Already you can tell there's not really much of a question mark here. We're providing definitive evidence attesting to the effectiveness of fact checking. So what does this mean, effectiveness of fact checking? Prior work has shown that fact checks generally reduce belief in misinformation. Tom and I have done this in prior papers in a book. Working with Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler, we found the same thing, that generally exposure to fact check leads people to become more accurate. There do, however, remain concerns about the potential for backfire. Now, backfire was perhaps more common 10 years ago, but remains a recurrent concern. And the concern with backfire is if I show you a fact check and it doesn't align with your political views, perhaps you will become less accurate as a result, right? So the fact check would be said to backfire if it actually made people less accurate. And there are occasional concerns about the backfire effect, which would, if it were widespread, would certainly indicate that Glenn and Angie, noble though they may be, would be wasting a fair bit of their time. There's a lot of sort of gaps in the literature on fact checking that Tom and I have spent a lot of time trying to fill. We don't know systematically whether or not fact checks produce accuracy gains that last. We don't know how those gains relate to partisanship and psychological traits. Here's another big thing. Sometimes in academia, it might seem that misinformation and fact checking are purely concerns of the United States, North America, and Australia. That's actually not the case. Misinformation and fact checking are both global phenomena. We don't have a systematic understanding of fact checking effect around the world, right? So how effective are they, not just in the US, but globally, how effective are they? We also don't know the effects of fact checking during COVID-19. Prior work has given scholars reason to think that that correcting misinfo about COVID and vaccines may actually trigger kinds of backfire effects, that people will be especially resistant to factual information about vaccines. So we're going to I'm going to present work to you today. Tom and I are going to present work that sort of answers all these questions through 3 studies. And what we do in our work typically is run randomized experiments. Randomized experiments work through the provision randomly of stimuli that we want to evaluate the effects of. In this case, we want to evaluate the effects of fact checks. Through randomization, we can assess how much fact checks specifically and fact checks cumulatively actually reduce false beliefs. This study that I'm going to describe for you today, Tom and I worked on with Alex Kopic of Yale, Kim Gross of GW, and Emily Thorson of Syracuse. We worked with PolitiFact too. Angie Holland is a close collaborator on this project and a good friend. And we evaluated the effectiveness of PolitiFact fact checks during the 2020 election. The way we did this, we tested 3 false claims 7 different times. So we actually ran 7 different experiments. 1 false claim, each experiment that was congenial to Democrats, 1 that was congenial to Republicans, and 1 that was just a free choice. Now what's congenial? What's a false claim congenial to Democrats? A false claim congenial to Democrats might accuse Donald Trump of having done something he didn't do. False claim congenial to Republicans might accuse Joe Biden and Democrats of something they didn't do. As I said, randomized experiment. What does that mean? Each false item, participants are randomly assigned to see either the underlying misinformation, that is the actual post or story that Angie and her team are correcting, the underlying misinformation followed by the PolitiFact fact check, or they're only going to answer a question about their belief in the false item. We tested these items contemporaneous to the production of their corresponding fact check. So this is really important. You might imagine that people far away from elections are able to respond to fact checks by becoming more factually accurate, but that during the heat of an election, when partisan passions are at their height, people become more resistant to fact checks. So we actually conducted these studies during the 2020 election from September through November. When Angie and her team would put out a fact check, we would test it pretty quickly thereafter. Just to give you all an example of the kind of misinformation that we tested. This is a real false claim that circulated widely. This was a Facebook post. This was sort of my favorite one, which alleged that Donald Trump said, the doctors said they've never seen a body kill the coronavirus like my body. They tested my DNA and it wasn't DNA, it was USA. So sort of funny, but that was real misinformation. It circulated a lot on Facebook and other social media platforms, and Angie and her team issued a correction. Here's another kind of fake news that we corrected, which is that at one point, Joe Biden criticized Donald Trump for holding the Bible upside down during the Lafayette Square tear gassing. That actually isn't true. Donald Trump did not hold the Bible upside down. Interestingly, several members of our research team did believe that he had held a Bible upside down. So misinformation even affects the beliefs of those who study it for a living. What about fact checking? These are the fact checks we looked at. These are pretty similar to what you've encountered. These are what you've encountered if you've ever read PolitiFact. Just a quick summary of the claim, and then a truthometer. So in this case, people assigned to see this fact check would see this headline, and they'd also see the whole fact check that Angie and her team had put together. Okay, so what happened? Fact checks worked. They reduced false beliefs. This figure displays the effects for all fact checks that we studied during the 2020 election. What you can see here is under each column, you can see control, misinformation, and fact check. I'm going to zoom in for a second just to really explain what this looks like, because there's a lot going on here. Okay. So this is a false claim. This is a real false claim that Joe Biden and Barack Obama plotted to have SEAL Team 6 murdered, right? So this is a false claim that circulated over social media. People in control, that is people who did not see either the misinformation or fact check, they were about 26.3% was the average response in terms of their confidence that this was a true belief, that this really happened. Okay, you can see people who saw the misinformation. You can see that number is higher, 33.4. The misinformation, where people just saw the misinfo that circulated, does indeed increase people's belief that Joe Biden and Barack Obama had SEAL Team 6 murdered. Okay, but then you look here, the smallest number is for the fact check, 23.5. So the fact check reduces false beliefs greater than the misinformation. It makes it smaller than the control, is basically the way to think about And that's generally the pattern here, where we find that fact checks reduce false beliefs, make beliefs more accurate than just the control. Fact checks work, which is another way of saying that they reduce false beliefs. The thing to really keep in mind, though, and that this is why we do fact checks in the first place, is exposure to misinformation increases false beliefs, right? So you can see this, this is a recurrent pattern in these results as well, right? So you can see, so for instance, if we look at this Donald Trump claim, what we see here is, this is the one I showed you, people in control actually believe that happened. The misinfo, people were slightly less confident, and the fact check people were least confident of all. So in general, we see fact checks reducing beliefs in false things. So that's a good thing, but misinformation also increasing. Okay, so that's a good story. These effects aren't huge. I want to be clear about this. These effects are not very large. Tom, do you want to jump in and add anything about this figure?
Go ahead, Ethan. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Okay, so let me show you. So this is the headline so far is fact checks work during the 2020 election insofar as they reduce false beliefs, but misinformation increases false beliefs. Okay, here's where it gets interesting, I think. We start looking at partisan differences. This is what we're doing here is we're showing you misinformation and correction effects by the respondent's party, okay? And what you can see here is we've bracketed, Democrats are a little lighter, Republicans are a little darker. This column, we're seeing agreement in the control condition. This is just how people think about these various issues if they haven't seen either misinformation or a correction. And what you can observe rather readily is that in this top row, are false claims are congenial to Republicans. Republicans are quite willing to believe misinformation that is congenial to their partisanship. The contrast between their beliefs and Democrats' beliefs on those issues is quite large. Now, compare that to how Democrats and Republicans, which you can glimpse here, respond to false claims that are congenial to Democrats. There you see much less difference between the dark and the hollow cells, which indicates to us that there's partisan asymmetry. Okay, that sans correction and sans misinformation, Republicans believe false things more. Okay, that's really interesting. That hasn't been studied systematically before. However, if you go here to correction misinformation effect columns, what you can observe is that though Democrats and Republicans believe misinformation at different levels when they're not exposed to the misinformation or fact check, they respond to both the correction and the misinformation in similar ways. So Republicans and Democrats come to a fact check or come to a misinformation differently, but contingent upon being exposed to it, they respond rather similarly. So the story shouldn't be, oh, we shouldn't fact check Republicans. The story should be Republicans may come in to a fact check more credulous toward the misinformation, but the effect of the correction will be roughly similar to what it would be for Democrats. What about over time? Remember what I said that we've got some evidence that fact checks work. We don't yet know how long those effects last. And this is the first time that we're aware of that researchers have actually investigated the long-term effects of fact checks. The best summary, I think, comes from this bottom row. In this bottom row, what you're seeing, this wave 1 is the immediate effect. Wave 2 is 1 week out. Wave 3 is 3 weeks out. We're putting together lots and lots of data. We're getting averages. And then in the circles, we're actually giving you the average of all the averages, okay? And so the average effect of a fact check right after seeing a fact check compared to a control is that the fact check reduces false beliefs by 7.2 points. That effect is still statistically detectable at wave 2 at 3.3, and it remains detectable at wave 3, with the effect smaller at wave 3, but still significant. So this is powerful evidence that fact checks not only work immediately, but that that their effects are powerful enough to actually change what people know. Because in the study of knowledge, just giving a response quickly after some information isn't generally considered a meaningful test. We want to know if people actually retain the knowledge that they gain. And indeed, this evidence indicates they do. You can see here we've broken it up by partisanship. Effects indeed are somewhat larger among Democrats than Republicans, but this is not just a case of Democrats remembering fact checks and Republicans forgetting it. On the contrary, both Republicans and Democrats retained more accurate beliefs up to 2 weeks afterwards. So fact checks don't only just work in the short term, they work over the long term too.
Ethan, if I could just add on that last slide before we move on, just the three waves. These are the same people in the three waves or different groups of people?
These are the same people, exactly, right? So we recontact people again and again and again. These are huge surveys by social science standards. If you guys want to get into the technicalities, I'm happy to chat. But in total, we're dealing with about 18,000 people. That compares pretty favorably to representative data. So these are huge surveys that are showing pretty persuasively that the effects of fact checks, though not as large as we might want them to be in the US during elections, are significant nonetheless. I'm just gonna then, I don't want to dive too much into this, but as I said earlier, we don't actually know the psychological properties that interact with people's responsiveness to fact checks. With our 18,000 people, we actually, before measuring any fact checks and giving them any misinfo, we also got the responses to a whole host of psychological batteries to figure out if different types of people are more responsive to fact checks than others. And what we find generally is that people who what you can think of as have a higher need for cognition, people who enjoy more cognitively demanding tasks, are people who are more powerfully affected by a fact check, which makes sense, right? A fact check, as you're familiar with, I'm sure, makes a cognitive demand on you, right? You have to really concentrate and read it, and the people who have a taste for that tend to be more affected by them. There's a flip side to that, which is that people who have high levels of political interest, that is, people who spend a lot of time thinking about politics, reading about politics, they're actually systematically less affected by fact checks, presumably because they already have their own prejudices about the facts and about the politics of the day. So in terms of who's responsive to fact checks, people who like cognitively demanding tasks are more likely to be powerfully affected by them, but people who love politics are likely to be less affected by them. That's new evidence that nobody has really dove into to the extent we have before. Okay, so during the 2020 election, fact checks durably reduced belief in misinformation. There's some evidence of partisan asymmetry in willingness to believe false claims, sans misinformation or fact checks. So Republicans and Democrats encounter both misinformation and fact checks differently. But both sides are made more accurate by fact checks. So it's not the case that only Democrats are responsive. Both sides become more accurate as a result. Accuracy increases are associated with cognitive appetite. So people who are more willing to do, you can think of as people who like crossword puzzles, they're more likely to perform, be more responsive to fact checks. Okay, so what about the rest of the world? We've shown rather persuasively, I think, and that fact checks work in the U.S. during an election, but maybe this is only just this is only a U.S. specific phenomenon. So Tom and I, over the last 3 years, have worked with fact-checking organizations around the world to conduct simultaneous experiments in Argentina, Nigeria, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. We conducted these experiments last fall, each time in all of these countries, working with fact-checking organizations in those countries. We tested 5 false claims in each country and also 2 global claims. We did randomization at the claim level, right? So we randomized what people, the false claim that people saw and whether or not they saw misinformation or a fact check. And then in 3 of the 4 countries, we were able to recontact subjects several weeks later, right, to see if the increases lasted at all. In Argentina, South Africa, and the UK. So let me give you a glimpse here of what kind of misinfo. This is one of the global items we corrected around the world. This is a false social media post that went viral. We translated it into Spanish for Argentina. This is just a false claim that went viral in March. This is real. My dad sent this to me in English, so this is a real thing. Basically, if you want to cure COVID, drink a lot of water and gargle with this is a real false claim. Fact check. Again, we translated to account for language differences. This is a glimpse of the fact check, which just is going to resemble the fact checks that you've seen elsewhere. We also tested a GIF. Lots of fact checkers are interested in formatting differences, the extent to which maybe images or visual verdicts might affect outcomes. And we got to test that as well. All right, so first I'm presenting you the main effects. What you should first look at is the bottom row, okay? These are the correction effects in each country for each item that we tested. And every item is below, every circle is below the dotted line, which means that for every single fact check, the fact check led people to become more accurate, okay? Which is not exactly what we expected. That is a more enthusiastic endorsement of fact checks than we anticipated. Contrast that with the misinformation effects. The misinformation effects, if all misinformation had led people to become more inaccurate, all these circles would be above the dotted line. That's not what you see. Some are, to be sure, but some are on the dotted line. Some are under the dotted line, which means that in some items, people saw the misinformation and without a fact check said, you know what, I don't believe that story at all, okay? So fact checks are much more powerful on average than misinformation is on its own around the world. These effects are also larger than the effects in the United States. Did they last? The answer for the most part is yes. Okay, these are the 3 of the 4 countries we were able to recontact 2 weeks later. More than half of the fact checks remained effective 2 weeks later. Okay, so this is not the case that people hear fact checks and goes in one ear and out the other. Fact checks remain effective over time, and they remain effective across continents, right? In Africa, South America, and Europe, fact checks remain effective, just as we showed in the previous study that fact checks during the 2020 election in the US, fact checks also remained effective. Here I'm showing you the meta effects. This is just a fancy kind of averaging. We're just averaging all the effects across all our studies on this 5-point scale that we've created to measure factual beliefs. Correction effects on average reduce false beliefs by 0.59 on a 5-point scale. That's a huge effect, right? For those of us, Tom and I spend all our lives doing survey research. That's a huge effect. Fact checks have a really large effect on making beliefs more accurate or less inaccurate. Misinformation effect, meanwhile, 0.07, super small effect, right? Not statistically significant. So once again, the headline is here, not only do fact checks work around the world, but fact checks have a much larger effect on beliefs than do misinformation sans fact check. So we have a misinformation crisis, to be sure, but corrections do wonders at repairing the damage. What about the format differences? This is a common question that Tom and I get. Okay, well, what about formats? We randomly varied the format of 3 different fact checks. We did visual fact checks for an item about vaccines causing cancer, a visual fact check for hundreds of children drowning in pit latrines, and a visual fact check for a claim about the number of shanty towns in Buenos Aires. It was only in this last visual fact check did we observe large differences in effects, with the visual GIF that I showed you earlier proving to be much more effective at increasing accuracy. So of the 3 that we investigated, of the 3 times we randomly investigated formats, 1 did change accuracy substantially more so than text, but 2 did not. Okay, so we've answered 2 big questions so far. I've shown you that fact checks work in the US. I've unpacked some psycholinguistic properties for you associated with their effectiveness, and I've showed you that they worked over time. I've also shown you that they worked over time around the world. Okay, what about COVID-19? So there's a lot of prior research into vaccines and beliefs, which shows that even if fact checks dispel false beliefs about vaccines, they can still diminish intent to vaccinate, right? So I might tell you, look, you're wrong about what falsehoods you believe about the vaccine. But even then, the fact check might make you less likely to get a vaccine. That's really worrisome. In COVID-19 times, researchers have begun to find that misinformation is diminishing intent to vaccinate, right? An article came out just this past month showing that there's a causal relationship between exposure to misinfo and intention to vaccinate. Okay, so this is a pressing problem. Once again, as you all know, fact-checking organizations and researchers are keenly interested in whether changes to fact-checking formats can make fact checks more effective. So Tom and I, working with Yamil Velez, we ran experiments that tested both questions. What are the effects of fact-checking on intent to take the COVID-19 vaccine? Vaccines plural, really. And how do changes to fact-checking formats matter? Okay, so we're going to try and kill two birds with one stone. Can we isolate the effects of fact-checking on not only beliefs, but intent to vaccinate? And do changes to fact-checking formats actually matter? We're going to have a similar setup as before, but this time we're also going to work, again with PolitiFact, to randomly vary many small formatting elements of each fact check. So some of the fact checks people saw had a visual verdict with the pants on fire attached. Others did not. Other times we compress the fact check, editing it down to minimize mentions of the original misinformation. Other times we kept the original long form version of the format. Other times we randomized whether or not the fact check had the too long didn't read summary, right? If your time is short summary. On the theory that maybe that has something to do with the effectiveness of the fact check. Okay, so what happens? What's the story with COVID-19 and fact checking? Before I give you these results, these are like, nobody has seen these before but me, Tom, Emil, and a few other people. These are hot off the presses, so to speak. First good news is fact checks about the vaccine never backfire. That's good news, right? It's never the case that seeing a fact check actually makes people less accurate in their beliefs. So that's good news, right? So that's nice. That's only confirming though what I've already shown you, right? Which is that backfire doesn't really happen. People become more accurate. These are just all the fake news, the sort of false claims we tested. Okay, so that's conclusion number one. Vaccine fact checks never backfire. Okay. Here's another cool thing. Vaccine fact checks do reduce false beliefs. So what we're looking at here again are averages. What you can see here is misinformation does indeed decrease accurate beliefs about the COVID vaccine. So you can see these are subjects who didn't see any misinfo. These are subjects who did. These are subjects who saw misinfo followed by the fact check. So misinfo without a fact check is indeed harmful, okay? It's a large misinformation effect, but boy, that correction effect is even larger. Well, you can think of it as misinfo does damage on its own to people's beliefs about the COVID-19 vaccine, but a fact check undoes that damage. So fact checks, misinfo is powerful, but fact checks are more powerful still. Here's another, I think, nice finding. We found what we call null effects across the board for intent to vaccinate. So remember I told you earlier that prior work suggests that sometimes fact checks make people less likely to get a vaccine. We didn't find that. We actually found nothing actually changes your willingness to get a vaccine. Your intent to vaccinate remains constant. Whether or not you saw misinfo or you saw misinfo followed by a fact check, we see no effect. We're still thinking through this, but in our mind, that probably means that people's views about vaccination, their own decisions, is actually not informed by misinfo or misinfo plus a fact check. Okay. What about formatting differences? I said earlier that formatting differences are likely, sort of a subject of perennial debate. So this is a little bit of a hard figure to make out, but it's super important to this debate. Here we're just backing out the effects of all the fact checks themselves on accurate beliefs. Okay, so you see these are the stories that we actually tested. Okay, these are the fact checks we actually tested. Above and below, we estimate the effects of the small tweaks to formats that we made and how those tweaks affected belief accuracy. And your eye should tell you the story here, which is that the small tweaks we make to formatting, including up here, right, with a statement at the top, these are really small. The effects are really small, compared to the effects of the fact checks themselves. So formatting differences, by and large, don't make a difference. It's when we isolate the effect of a fact check, that's what makes the difference at reducing false beliefs. So these formatting differences are small. Okay, so let's just sum up everything we've done here. Fact checks consistently work. They do not backfire. They increase accuracy, right? So again, and I tell Angie and Glenn this semi-regularly, you're not wasting your time. You're doing great work. Fact checking is super effective. This we've shown to be true during the US elections, during COVID-19, and we've shown it around the world. So it's not a case of US subjects being distinct. It's not a case of COVID-19 somehow changing things. It's not even a case of the US political climate preventing fact checks from being effective. Instead, in all of those different sort of use studies, we find fact checks work. Anecdotally, it seems that the effects of fact checks are larger outside of the US. That's, we didn't systematically study that, but that jumps off the page to us when we think about our work, which is that the accuracy increases we saw in all 4 countries that we studied outside of the US, significantly larger, which is really worth thinking through. Formatting choices may matter, but not often and not to a great extent. So, in our global study, we found 1 of 3 formatting choices making a difference. But in the COVID-19 study, we did not find any such effects. So overall, fact checks work. They work in many occasions. They're working now during COVID-19. They may be larger, more impactful outside the US. And the formatting differences matter, but they're likely not. They're not doing nearly as much as just the sheer fact of the fact check itself. Okay, thanks. We'd love to, Tom, do you have stuff to add?
Yeah, I will not take any more time. I'll just say a couple things. It's just in a sense, you guys are working in like the emergency room of democracy. Like by the time a false claim has come up to the point where it's being covered in the mainstream press, that's at the point where political entrepreneurs, bad faith actors, or your cousin on Facebook has really found a claim that can like bite and gain currency among a large audience. So in a sense, these are the most demanding tests for people's factual adherence. And that we reliably find that simple factual rebuttals improve the average respondent's factual accuracy, I think should be taken as very, very compelling evidence that the work you guys are doing reliably improves the reading public's, the news consuming public's accuracy. And then just the other final thing I want to sort of get at is I often have conversations with practitioners, and you guys have regular jobs. You can't stay very close to the literature on a day-by-day basis. And so you might have heard things about like identity protective cognition, or the idea that people are willing to counter-argue ideas they regard as threatening to themselves, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to sort of affirm that that's a very inaccurate sort of heuristic to be carrying around, thinking about how regular people respond to the news. Regular people are not like academics or journalists who are like really committed to the day-by-day minutiae of political fights. The kinds of people who are just doom scrolling social media and coming across the work wonderful journalists put out there, a more accurate understanding of how they engage with the news is simply that, gosh, like I'm glad I learned that. And that basically explains the pattern of finding that Ethan and I come up with reliable factual improvements across the board. But we'd love to have your questions and ideas for future kinds of this work.
Okay, so let's go to Q&A. Anybody want to get started? We'll go to Riley.
Hi guys, I'm Riley Beggin with the Detroit News. Thanks so much for talking to us. I thought that was really interesting that you said that the effects of fact checks are larger outside the US. I'm just curious what you make of that. I mean, is that an indicator that we're experiencing more political polarization than other countries at the moment?
I think that's probably consistent. what you've explained is probably consistent with our findings, that in some ways our findings are wrapped up in political polarization. The other sort of speculative idea I would offer is that though there are fact-checking organizations on the ground in other countries, they're not as robust, as prominent, and as visible as they are in the United States. People's views toward fact-checking organizations in the US tend to be polarized in ways that I doubt they're polarized in other countries. But important to note, though, that like, yeah, it's true, Republicans don't like PolitiFact as much as Democrats do, but Republicans are also made more accurate by PolitiFact fact checks. So for sure, we're a more polarized country, but like people respond to factual information in roughly the same way.
Can I just add on to Ethan's answer? When Ethan says more than other countries, the most comparison cases we have in our sort of empirical toolkit are developing countries with much lower levels of educational attainment. And the best comparison we have for a country with a comparable level of education and therefore polarization is the UK, where fact checks appear about as modest as they appear here in the US. So yeah, like polarization has been getting a really bad rap. Of course, like one of the strongest individual level correlates of polarization is education level. We've invested, trillions of dollars in wonderful public universities, like to make people very ideologically constrained and to conceive of all of politics, as like a team sport. And so places where there is a lower level of educational attainment, people are more inclined to come at politics in a completely non-ideological way.
All right, let's go to Adrian.
Hi, hello, Adrian Blanco from the Washington Post. I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned that you detected some partisan asymmetry regarding the effects of fact-checking. I would like to know why is this happening and if you have any theories about it.
So yeah, that's a great question. We've thought about this a lot. So actually, Angie and PolitiFact have given us a fair bit of their internal traffic data. And we've analyzed that traffic data and trying to figure out how it relates to the effects of different fact checks. And the simple truth is that Republicans are exposed to many more false claims more often. So the false claims that favor Republicans tend to be much more widely trafficked and tend to provoke much more popular fact checks that follow them. So I think you're dealing just with different informational ecosystems. Republicans are more likely to encounter false claims than Democrats, which in turn, and again, speculatively, makes them less discerning with the information they do see. I mean, just as a point of interest, when we were designing the US election study, it's actually hard to find misinfo in the US that circulates widely that flatters Democrats. A fair bit of it exists, and we all know it, that flatters Republicans, right? That undercuts Democrats. The opposite is harder to find and is less popular, which I think accounts for how Republicans are more likely to believe information when they hear it that is false. But again, we don't know that. Like that's just my guess.
It's also with these data, it's hard to figure out. Like we were choosing those most heavily trafficked Republican and Democratic issues, so we wanted to make this as politically relevant as possible. So the things that most people went to PolitiFact to find out. And as Ethan said, like the nature of the Republican and Democratic appetite for those things is confounded by a million things. And so, like I feel as to put all our cards on the table, I don't even know we have enough data at this point to necessarily suggest that the findings that Ethan showed you are necessarily something that's intrinsic to the factual credulity of Democrats and Republicans, or into the kinds of issues that get trafficked on either side. If a populist president was elected on the Democratic side, and he spent 4 years denigrating the press and like the elites, maybe we'd observe comparable effects that we observed in this sample. It's confounded by a million things. It's an important question, but we just have a very ineffective set of tools to answer.
Just one last thing on this. So like one way to maybe a simple way of thinking about it is like, imagine that you're a Republican and your news diet includes misinformation frequently. You then you're a participant then in one of our studies. We ask you if you believe in that. You're far more likely to have seen that in your media diet than our Democrats who, we asked about the false news congenial to them, right? So agreeing with false news that denigrates the other side is perhaps for the Republican Party a sort of a partisan signal, right? You do that to cheerlead for your team. And that would be a different explanation than different psychological properties that separate the parties.
All right, we'll go to Nicholas and then Tia next.
Hi there, my name is Nicholas Wu and I'm a congressional reporter at USA Today. I had a question on whether you had noticed any effects in terms of, I guess, the source of the outlet doing the fact-checking operation. So, like, to use Facebook's fact-checking partnerships as an example, they have partnerships with outlets that could be classified as somewhat right-leaning. So like Daily Caller affiliated site, and then the Dispatch. Does this have any effect on how people perceive the fact-check, or is it just it gets thrown out there and then it's just treated as is?
So yeah, we've investigated this a few different times. So in the most recent COVID-19 study, mentioning PolitiFact didn't make a difference at all. In earlier work, Tom and I have attributed misinformation and fact checks to really partisan sources like Fox News. You run down the list. We find that the effects are rare, but when they do exist, they're pretty small. So I'm sure it happens, but I think the effects are likely going to be pretty small, smaller than we anticipated when we first started dipping our toe in this water.
And a couple of years ago, we asked folks to evaluate the ideological valence of certain American news organizations. And it was like stunning. Outside of like Fox News, like regular American conservatives have a very poor understanding, like what commentary is, or the National Review, or Mother Jones. And so in a sense, it's like, again, regular Americans aren't like journalists or academics. The number of outlets with the American public knows enough to say, this is a vendor of my team, or this is a vendor of my opponents, is very small. And even when, as Edison says, when we design the experiments to be like the New York Times and Fox News, the effects are modest. So the Daily Caller, gosh, I don't know, like, does the run-of-the-mill American conservative know that like it's ideological valence?
Yeah, I mean, so just two other things, right? That also reminds me, like, a really strong predictor of disbelief in fact checks is political interest, right? So once you just accounting for people's political interest, the high interest people, they're going to be less responsive. The other thing I would think about too is in a study in 2016, we studied a fact check of Donald Trump. Okay, this is when Trump was lying about crime. We studied a fact check. We then studied how Republicans viewed the fact check. Republican Trump supporters were made more accurate after seeing a fact check, even though they distrusted and they found the fact check not credible. Okay, so there's this really interesting process, right? Where if you see a fact check, you may still be made more accurate by it, even if you regard it as like partisan, whatever. You're like, oh, that's just partisan nonsense. But you will still move in the direction of greater accuracy, which is really interesting.
All right, we'll go to Tia.
Hi, I wanted to ask, I work for a daily newspaper, and do you guys have any best practices or suggestions for like fact checking within the bounds of a news report? Because, for example, I might cover Marjorie Taylor Greene, who says something, that isn't accurate about the US Capitol riots, or isn't accurate about transgender legislation. Should we quote, not quote, paraphrase, do it high, do it low?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think in general, you should not be afraid to fact check. And in the past, well, actually, no, that's not true. So I would say don't be afraid to fact check, right? That's point number one. Like if you're, and by fact check, just like present empirical evidence that is contrary to the claim. Just like Marjorie Taylor Greene says, the Capitol insurrection was caused by Trump people. It's like, no, here are the indictments of Trump supporters. That's just a fact. And in terms of like length of how much time you spend litigating the fact check, I would say, so I expected that smaller fact checks would be more effective. That was my prediction. It was like, people just want a concise summary. We've actually found some evidence of the opposite, that actually it's sort of like when you really get into it and you're like, no, here are all the reasons she's wrong, that's going to be more effective. But the differences are small, right? Like the differences are really small. Yeah, so, but in any event, I would say, like, don't be afraid to fact check.
The one other advice I think we're qualified to provide is, gosh, 5 or so years ago, there was this concern of like a familiarity effect wherein, gosh, the advice used to be, you can never provide the underlying claim you intend to fact check simply because it just the familiarity makes it appear truthful. That hasn't replicated such that if you want to quote the thing you're specifically addressing, like this specific false claim was made about transgender policy in the Biden administration, I would suggest that the best evidence is that in fact improves the accuracy of the subsequent thing, because you realize it's not just saying Marjorie Taylor Greene is endemically inaccurate. This specific thing she said doesn't have the property of being true. And so absent familiarity backfire, I think it improves the accuracy of these debunks for you to explain the false claim that's being addressed.
I also, also on this question that I think is really useful. If you're ever criticized for fact checking, and say, oh, but you're putting your thumb on the scale, that's just because you don't like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Our evidence also has shown repeatedly that fact checks work on people, but they don't change people's views toward the politician, right? And that's really important, right? So that's happened again and again with Trump supporters in our studies, where we show Trump supporters corrections, they become more accurate as a result. They don't dislike Trump anymore, right? So this concern, oh, by fact checking, we're like intervening and it's like, no, like fact checking, you're just making your readers more accurate. That's all, which I think is awesome. And I think is another reason why, I'm on team fact checking.
Okay, Abby next.
Hi, thanks for doing this. I have a question about whether publications who have traditional fact-checking departments, in the sense that they have groups of people who read and re-research and re-report stories after they've been written, if that should be a process that publications highlight more, that they do, to lend credibility. Like, I know that Reuters at the bottom of their articles, at least last time I checked, will indicate who an article has been fact checked by. And I work for a publication that does fact check big features by people outside of the writer. So I'm wondering whether it would make readers more trusting of a news report if it was called out that it was fact checked by an external person.
My guess would be yes. Like we haven't actually tested that, but I also think too that this gets back to the earlier question, which is like, yes, conditional on people being interested enough to read the whole article, right? And that is something that is I think really interesting. That fact checks are effective on like people who have a high cognitive appetite, right? Like I just think about the crossword puzzles all the time, right? Like if you have a high need for cognition, like if you've ever read, people read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about, there are two kinds, the system 1 and system 2. Like if you like puzzles, word games, then you're more likely to read the whole fact check or the whole article, and you'll see that detail. Then yeah, absolutely, that probably will at the margins make a difference. The bigger challenge, of course, is like getting people to read the fact check who are not, who wouldn't want to on their own accord. That's a much harder task. That I'm happy to chat about. Tom and I have done some work on that with Angie at PolitiFact. We have some results, but that is, I think, sort of the big task for fact checking now is like, okay, fact checks work, but like how do we get more people to read them? And that is, I think, the sort of next frontier.
I would just say, Abby, the first thing you should do is follow me back on Twitter. For you to be an ex-student and not follow me, I'm not going to say it like I carry it around with me as like a shame, but it doesn't make me feel good. I will say that. And second, go Buckeyes. And I would say, Abby, my concern with your intuition, I think, is is healthy from an American democratic perspective. I don't think we'll ever get to the point where regular news media consumers know a ton about the internal organization of news media orgs. So I don't think it will be the point where we'll see different experimental effects. But insofar as more disclosure is good for those people who happen to be the kinds of people who are fascinated by the internal machinations of the news media industry. I think it's great. But it strikes me as a very abstruse question to matter for regular people who have prosaic demands in their life.
Wait a minute, I missed something. Abby and Thomas, do you know each other?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't.
One of my professors at Ohio.
I didn't want to reveal it, Abby, but yes, Abby, she went to OSU, in case you wonder why she's so astute.
It was probably
Okay.
my hardest political science class at Ohio State. I remember being very stressed.
Oh, good.
Very
Was
often.
it a methods class or something else? What was it?
It was some kind of
Just me blathering away.
lots of graphs. It was about voting trends.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad to bring student and teacher back together again. So anybody else have a question? I got one or two. One is fairly specific and one is very kind of broad and dumb. But the specific one, Ethan, when you're talking about formatting, what do you mean by formatting? I mean, and does formatting getting into, I'm curious about whether formatting gets into the way conclusions are presented and whether these cheeky things like pants on fire or Pinocchios have an effect on whether somebody is likely to, take the corrective effect seriously, I guess.
Yeah, it definitely means that. We investigated. The thing we did, and I thought about trying to present this graphically, but it's sort of complicated. But imagine a PolitiFact fact check now, and imagine deconstructing it into all its constituent parts, and then imagine randomizing which constituent parts people saw. So one of those parts is the verdict, right? Pants on fire. We also randomized the length of the fact check. Okay, so sometimes we litigated out the misinformation, and other times we edited it down to remove a lot of the work that PolitiFact had done. And so the visual verdict, as we call it, the pants on fire, doesn't really make a difference. It doesn't harm anything. It's not bad. But in terms of the size of the increase, the no frills fact check worked just as well. And by no frills, no visuals, no summary, just what this story that you read or this post that you saw is wrong, and here's why. That works just as well. So that's does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And then kind of the big dumb guy question is, I don't, you've done some great social science research and I don't discount it. And so that's one truth. The other truth is a third of the country, believes the election was stolen, which is something that's been fact checked and corrected in so many different ways. How do I square those two realities?
I would say two, and I know Thomas' thoughts on this too. So the first is, if there were no fact checking, that 1/3 might be much larger, right? Like in the counterfactual, there's no fact checking. Far more people believe that than do now. And this is what I was saying earlier. We need to get more people reading fact checks. I think that's clear. I think previous work has shown this, where the people who read fact checks are not the people who consume misinformation in the real world. That's the problem we need to confront, and that explains, I think, a fair bit of what you're seeing. I know Thomas' thoughts on this too. So, Tom, what do you think?
Oh, so many thoughts. On the one hand, exposure to fact checks is a fixable problem. Facebook could solve 80 to 90% of this problem this afternoon with a simple engineering solution would massively increase the exposure to news media fact checks. In terms of the American public's aggregate accuracy, I invite you, look at the Morning Consult polling series on QAnon adherence. Since the failure of the Q story after the inauguration, we've halved the number of Americans who believe in the Q account. Q support is just cratering. And that's not something that's weird about the Q conspiracy. Most conspiracy theories degrade in adherence over time. Fewer Americans believe Barack Obama was born in Kenya. Way fewer Americans believe that 9/11 was an inside job. Way fewer Americans believe that Israel tricked the United States into entering the Iraq War. The only conspiracy theory that seems really persistent is the JFK conspiracy theory. And there's not the problem of insufficient fact checking. There's the problem of, there's a pretty clear problem with insufficient fact checking in that so many authoritative sources tend to cohere with the misinformation account. And so I guess we should be careful. The aggregate evidence actually suggests the American public is doing pretty well. And following these big factual interventions, the American public's typical response is to become more accurate, not less accurate.
Yeah, I just want to underline Tom's point. We have another paper where we show that fact checks work in simulations of Facebook really well, right? So we worked with a civil society group to test out fact checks over Facebook or over a simulation of Facebook, and they work really well. Facebook has chosen not to, Facebook makes a choice. They choose not to compel people who consume misinformation to see fact checks. If they made a different choice, the public would be vastly better informed. It's like, that's just up to, I think, social pressure and, political pressure to be applied to them. I think like there is a solvable problem, and like the answer lies with Facebook, just to a large extent.